The rain came down the way it always does in Claremont, Georgia, in late October, not in a dramatic downpour, but in that relentless, suffocating drizzle that soaks through everything and turns the asphalt into a dark mirror, reflecting headlights back at you in long, distorted streaks. It was 11:50 p.m. on a Thursday, and Route 7 was nearly empty, the kind of quiet that only exists in that narrow window between midnight bar traffic and the first early morning commuters. A dark green Honda Pilot moved through the rain at exactly 45 miles per hour. Not 43, not 47, exactly the limit, because the woman behind the wheel had been driving this road for 11 years and had long ago learned that the stretch between the Millbrook Street underpass and the Glenview overpass was a favorite hunting ground for patrol cars looking to meet their quota. To anyone peering through the rain-streaked glass, she would have appeared to be exactly what she looked like: an exhausted black woman in her late 40s, wearing an oversized Spelman College hoodie that had been washed so many times. The lettering had softened at the edges. A pair of reading glasses pushed up on top of her head, and the kind of deep, bone-tired expression that only comes from staring at legal documents for 16 straight hours. Her most striking feature, visible even in the poor light, was her hair, a magnificent full crown of thick, natural locks that hung past her shoulders, each one carefully maintained, the product of 18 years of patience, cultural pride, and a dedication that most people reserve for things they consider sacred, because to her they were. What that casual observer would never have guessed, what Officer Dale Pruitt, idling in his squad car under the Millbrook Street underpass 100 yards behind her, absolutely did not know, was that the woman in the Spelman hoodie was the Honorable Renata Cross, United States District Court Judge of the 11th Circuit, appointed 9 years ago, and confirmed by a Senate vote that had been for once largely uncontested, because her record was simply too formidable to argue with. Renata Cross had presided over cases that had reshaped labor law in 4 southeastern states. She had authored opinions that were now cited in law school casebooks. She had been offered a seat on the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals twice, and had declined both times because she wasn't finished yet with the district-level work, and because Renata Cross did not take a promotion until she decided she was ready for it, not when someone else thought she should be. Tonight, she had spent the last 16 hours in her private chambers on the 4th floor of the 11th Circuit Federal Courthouse, reviewing a mountain of discovery documents, affidavit transcripts, internal affairs reports, and forensic evidence logs for what the local press had taken to calling the most significant police corruption trial in Claremont's history. The trial began in 5 days. It involved a rogue narcotics unit within the Claremont Police Department, a tight-knit group of officers who over nearly a decade had allegedly built an empire of illegal behavior behind the shield of their badges. The indictments were severe evidence, planting warrantless searches carried out under false pretexts, coerced confessions, extortion of local business owners, and a coordinated pattern of civil rights violations targeting primarily Black and Latino residents in the city's lower-income neighborhoods. The federal grand jury had taken 14 months to build the case. Renata had been assigned to preside over the trial 8 weeks ago. She was known in the legal community the way certain natural phenomena are known quietly, with a mixture of respect and wariness. She was brilliant, thorough, and utterly immune to the kind of institutional pressure that tended to quietly bend other judges. Prosecutors who appeared before her loved her because she ran an airtight courtroom. Defense attorneys who appeared before her respected her for exactly the same reason, even when that tightness worked against them. She was not unkind. She was not cold. But she was in every sense of the word formidable. None of that was visible tonight. Tonight she was just a tired woman in a college hoodie navigating slick asphalt, her eyes dry and slightly stinging from hours under fluorescent lighting, her mind still running through the implications of a particular piece of testimony she had read at 9 p.m. She had a 14-year-old son at home who had left a plate of reheated pasta on the stove for her with a sticky note that said, "Don't let it get cold again, Mom." which was his way of saying he loved her and missed her, and she was thinking about that pasta and about the boy who made it, and not about anything else when the red and blue lights exploded in her rearview mirror. She exhaled slowly through her nose. She signaled. She pulled the pilot smoothly onto the gravel shoulder. She cut the engine, placed both hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, and sat perfectly still, the rain drumming steadily on the roof. This was the protocol she had made her son memorize when he turned 16. Hands visible, no sudden movements, no reaching for anything without narrating it clearly first. She had sat him down at the kitchen table and made him repeat it back to her 3 times, because she understood in her marrow that a badge did not always mean safety, and because she was his mother, and she would not let the world take him by surprise. She had not expected to need the protocol herself tonight, but here she was. The Millbrook Street underpass had been Officer Dale Pruitt's favorite position for 11 of his 17 years with the Claremont Police Department. The concrete arch threw enough shadow to hide the cruiser from casual view, and the angle gave him a clean line of sight on both directions of Route 7. He liked to call it fishing, which told you most of what you needed to know about how he thought of the people driving past him as potential catches, not as citizens going about their lives. Pruitt was 51 years old, white broad across the shoulders and chest, in the way of a man who had been physically imposing in his 30s, and had let that physicality curdle into something slower and meaner by his 50s. He had a personnel file that was by any objective measure a disaster. 11 use-of-force complaints in 17 years, 2 internal affairs investigations for excessive force, 1 formal reprimand for conduct unbecoming, and a pattern of resisting arrest charges that an independent review would later describe as statistically anomalous in comparison to his peers. None of it had ever resulted in meaningful consequence. The union had buried it. His captain, a man named Vic Harlan, who golfed with the union president on alternate Saturdays, had described Pruitt in performance reviews as a tough but effective street-level officer, and had ensured that the paperwork in his file remained a collection of allegations rather than a record of accountability. Pruitt knew exactly where the line was. He had spent 17 years testing it and 17 years watching it bend. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Officer Shane Garrett, 26 years old, and 4 months out of the academy, who was still in the phase of his career where he arrived for each shift, telling himself that this was the night he would be genuinely useful. He had grown up in Claremont, the son of a high school history teacher and a dental hygienist, and he had joined the department because he had meant it when he said in his interview that he wanted to serve his community. 4 months of riding with Dale Pruitt had not yet extinguished that belief entirely, but it had put it under significant pressure. Renata's dark green Pilot passed the underpass at exactly 11:52 p.m., moving at exactly the speed limit. Headlights perfectly aligned, no visible equipment violations. Pruitt tapped the steering wheel with 2 fingers and made a sound in the back of his throat. "Look at this one," he muttered, watching the taillights disappear into the rain. "She's doing 45 in a 45, Garrett said, squinting through the wiper blades. He had learned by now to say the obvious thing clearly and early, because sometimes, not often, but sometimes it actually worked. Exactly. Pruitt smiled at the windshield. Suspicious. He threw the cruiser into gear, flipped on the lights and siren, and pulled out of the underpass before Garrett could form another sentence. Pruitt approached the Pilot from the driver's side, his heavy steel flashlight cutting through the rain, the beam trained directly at Renata's face in a way that forced her to look away. He did not announce himself. He did not state the reason for the stop. Both of these were legal requirements, and both were things Dale Pruitt had been casually ignoring for the better part of 2 decades. License, registration, proof of insurance. Now. His voice had that particular quality, not quite a shout, but aimed and hard, the voice of a man who expected every sentence he spoke to be obeyed before it finished echoing. "Good evening, officer." Renata kept her voice level, her eyes moving slightly to the side to avoid the direct beam. May I ask why I was pulled over? Something shifted behind Pruitt's eyes. It was a subtle thing, a slight tightening around the jaw, a flicker of irritation crossing into something colder. He was not accustomed to the question being asked. In his experience, people answered it by immediately fumbling for their wallets. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he said, leaning closer to the window, his forearm resting on the roof of the car. "Now, actually, officer, under the law you do." Renata's voice did not waver. It was not defiant in tone, it was factual, the way a person states the time. "If you are detaining me, I have a right to know the articulable suspicion for the stop." The words articulable suspicion landed in the space between them like something thrown. Pruitt straightened slightly. Behind him, back near the trunk, Garrett went very still. "Oh, we got a roadside lawyer." Pruitt looked back over his shoulder at Garrett with a short, contemptuous laugh, then turned back. "Listen to me very carefully. You're going to hand over your ID right now, or I am going to pull you out of this car, and you will hand it over that way. Your choice." Renata reached slowly toward the passenger seat, narrating each movement. "I am reaching for my bag." She retrieved her wallet, removed her driver's license with deliberate care, and held it out the window. Pruitt snatched it from her fingers without looking at it. In the poor light in the rain, staring at a black woman in a hoodie who had just cited the Fourth Amendment at him, he did not read the name on the license. He saw what he expected to see, and what he expected to see was a problem he was about to solve. "Step out of the vehicle." Renata's hands returned to the steering wheel. "On what grounds I have provided my identification? Have I committed a traffic violation?" "I said step out of the vehicle." His voice dropped lower, which was somehow more dangerous than if it had risen. "Do not make me say it again." "Officer." Pruitt was done talking. He grabbed the door handle from the outside, yanked it open, reached in, and seized Renata's left arm with both hands. He hauled her out of the pilot with a violence that snapped her head forward and sent her glasses skittering off the roof into the rain-soaked gravel. He spun her and slammed her chest first against the wet metal of the car door, her cheek against the cold roof, the rain hitting the back of her neck. "Stop! What are you doing?" The shock of the impact forced the words out of her before she could stop them. Not panic, but the involuntary response to sudden, unprovoked physical force. "She's resisting, Walsh." Pruitt caught himself, looked back. "Garrett, get up here. She's resisting." "I am not resisting," Renata said. And it was remarkable. Her voice had steadied itself within 3 seconds, drawn back from the shock by 17 years of courtroom discipline. "I am not resisting. You are conducting an unlawful arrest. I want your badge number." Pruitt kicked her feet apart, wrenched her arms behind her back, and snapped the handcuffs on. They bit into her wrists hard enough to raise welts. "You want my badge number?" He laughed, and the sound of it was ugly in the rain. "You're going to get a lot more than that, sweetheart. You're going to jail tonight for assaulting a police officer." Garrett had moved to the side of the vehicle. His face in the amber glow of the streetlight was the color of old plaster. He had watched what happened. He had watched the whole thing, the window, the door, the slam, the handcuffs, and not 1 second of it had been a resisting suspect requiring physical intervention. He opened his mouth. Brad. Just his name. Just the one syllable. "Get the door," Pruitt said, not looking at him. Garrett got the door. As Pruitt guided Renata to the back of the cruiser, with a hand on the back of her neck, she was already doing something that he would never understand, and that she would later describe on the witness stand with a calm that made 3 jurors visibly shiver. She was memorizing. The time on the dash clock, 11:58 p.m. The badge number partially obscured by Pruitt's vest, 1147. The complete absence of a stated violation. The excessive force applied to a non-resisting subject. The fact that Garrett had witnessed all of it and said nothing useful. The fact that when Pruitt shoved her head down to put her in the back seat, He said with a sneer so casual, it might have been a pleasantry. "Watch your head." The door slammed shut. The dark closed in. The rain drummed on the roof of the cruiser. Renata Cross took one slow, measured breath and began to build her case. The Claremont 6th Precinct was not the worst building in the city, but it smelled like one. At 12:40 in the morning, it had the particular ambiance of a place that had seen too much of the worst that people do to each other and had stopped being surprised by any of it. Stale coffee baked into the walls, a persistent undertone of disinfectant that never quite masked what it was covering, and the low droning hum of fluorescent lights that had 2 or 3 bulbs flickering in that irregular rhythm that makes people feel vaguely unwell. The booking desk was staffed by Sergeant Walt Briggs, a wide, gray-haired man of 58, who wore his approaching retirement the way some men wear an old coat with total comfort and zero intention of ever taking it off. Briggs had been with the department for 29 years. He had stopped asking questions about the arrests that Pruitt brought in approximately 12 years ago, because asking questions had never changed anything, and had occasionally made his life more complicated, and at 58, with a fishing cabin in the Smokies, waiting for him in 14 months, complication was the last thing Walt Briggs wanted. He didn't look up when Pruitt came through the door with Renata. "What do we have?" Brad Pruitt dropped Renata's property bag, her wallet, her phone, her reading glasses retrieved from the gravel onto the desk. Assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, obstruction of justice. He rattled them off the way a man orders off a menu he's memorized. Briggs's fingers moved over the keyboard. Processing system still down from the update. Briggs grunted. He still hadn't looked at the woman standing in front of him in handcuffs. He glanced at the property bag logged. It never opened the wallet to look at the ID inside. "Take her to holding cell 4. We'll process when the system's back online." "I am entitled to my phone call." Renata's voice was quiet, clear and precise as a scalpel. It cut through the ambient noise of the precinct and produced the first moment of the night in which Walt Briggs actually looked at her directly for a full 2 seconds before looking back at his screen. Pruitt turned to face her from 2 feet away. "You get a phone call when I say you get a phone call. Right now, you're an officer safety risk." He stepped beside her. "Turn around. Officer, denying me my phone call is a constitutional violation. I am documenting this moment and the time." She looked at the clock on the wall behind Briggs. 12:48 a.m. Pruitt uncuffed her right hand, recuffed it in front, pushed her ahead of him down the cell block corridor. He unlocked cell 4 concrete walls, a steel bench bolted to the floor, a steel toilet in the corner, a single overhead light behind a wire cage, and pushed her inside. He didn't uncuff her immediately. He let her stand there for a moment, cuffed in that cold, damp space, while he savored the mechanics of his own authority. Then he unlocked the cuffs, stepped back, and slammed the barred door shut. The lock engaged with a heavy metallic thunk. Renata stood in the center of the cell. She did not rush to the bench. She stood still and let her eyes move carefully around the room, cataloging it, the way she cataloged a courtroom she had not seen before. Dimensions, surfaces, sight lines, air quality. The cell smelled of bleach underneath something organic and unpleasant. The steel bench was cold enough that she could feel it radiating through the air. The overhead light buzzed faintly, and then she saw it. In the upper corner of the ceiling, mounted where the 2 walls met, a black dome-shaped security camera. Small, slightly dusty on its upper surface, but the indicator light on its face was red and steady. Recording. Renata Cross sat down on the steel bench, placed her bruised wrists carefully on her knees, and looked directly at that small red light with something that was not quite a smile, but was very close to it. Good, she thought. Keep recording. Don't stop. The precinct settled into its late-night rhythms. The Friday crowd in the holding area thinned. 2 drunk drivers processed and transported a domestic disturbance, resolved and documented a petty theft arraignment, postponed to morning. The fluorescent hum became the dominant sound. Officers moved through the corridors in ones and twos. The desk sergeant's keyboard provided a sporadic counterpoint. In cell 4, Renata sat. She did not lie down on the bench, because the cold of the steel was too severe, and she did not pace, because pacing was a luxury of panic, and she was not panicking. She was doing what she had learned to do in the most difficult hours of her career. She was thinking slowly and completely, taking an enormous problem apart into its component pieces and examining each one. She cataloged the constitutional violations committed in the last hour, the way she would catalog evidence for a ruling, the unlawful stop with no articulable suspicion, the failure to state the reason for detention, the excessive force applied to a non-resisting subject, the fabricated charge of assault, the denial of Miranda rights, the denial of a phone call. Each one was a nail in a coffin she was quietly building. She did not know sitting there what was coming next. She thought Pruitt was done with her for the night, that this was the entirety of his cruelty, that he would process her in the morning. She would make her call, and the machinery of justice would begin to turn. She was tired. Her shoulder ached from the wrenching of her arm. Her wrists were sore, but she was intact, and she was thinking clearly, and she had a camera watching. She was wrong about Pruitt being done. At 3:05 a.m., the cell block door opened. The sound was unmistakable, heavy industrial. A mechanism designed to communicate that passage through it was controlled entirely by someone who was not you. Renata did not stand. She turned her head and watched the corridor. Pruitt appeared at the barred door of cell 4. He was holding something at his right side, half obscured by his body. Behind him, hanging back near the cell block entrance, in a way that communicated everything about what he was feeling, was Garrett. Pruitt unlocked the door. He stepped inside, and now she could see what he was holding: a pair of heavy industrial trauma shears, the kind kept in first aid cabinets for cutting through thick clothing or field dressings. The blades were long and dull silver under the caged light. Renata stood. "What is this?" "Standard precinct health and safety protocol." Pruitt's voice was smooth, almost pleasant, in the particular way of a man who has rehearsed a lie until it sounds casual. "You engaged in a physical altercation with an officer. You've got all that hair." He gestured at her locks with the closed shears, as if she were not a person, but a situation requiring management. "Lice protocol. We have to cut it off." From the doorway, Garrett's voice came in barely above a whisper. "Brad, you can't do this. That protocol is only for documented infestations. There's no documented. We don't have any basis for." "Wait outside, Garrett." Pruitt didn't even turn around. "This suspect is uncooperative and a hygiene risk. I am following department policy. Brad, please, outside." Now he did turn just enough to let Garrett see his face. Whatever Garrett saw there made him step back. He turned. He put his hands over his face, leaned against the corridor wall, and stayed there. The cell door had not closed. Renata looked at the shears. She looked at Pruitt's face. And for the first time in the 11 hours since she had left her chambers, something underneath her composure shifted. Not broke, but shifted. Because she understood in an instant and with complete clarity what this was. This was not policy. This was not protocol. This was a man who had spent 17 years using a badge as a vehicle for the specific cruelty of making people who had not submitted to him pay a physical price for their dignity. He had brought her here in handcuffs. He had charged her with crimes she had not committed. And now, because she had looked him in the eye on Route 7 and quoted the law at him and not cowered, he had come to take something that could not be uncharged and could not be expunged. Her hair represented 18 years. 18 years of patience and growth and cultural identity, and a daily choice to wear her heritage in a world that frequently made black women pay for exactly that choice. They were not just locks. They were a history. They were her grandmother's hands teaching her to care for them. They were her son touching them when he was small, running his fingers through them with that particular unself-conscious toddler fascination. They were hers entirely, in a way that very few things in her intensely public professional life actually were. Pruitt was going to cut them off because she had not bowed. Officer Pruitt. She read his name tag with deliberate precision, each syllable clear. If you touch me with those shears, you will face consequences that you cannot begin to comprehend. What you are describing is not a valid department protocol. It is a felony battery. It is a violation of my Fourth and Eighth Amendment rights. It constitutes an assault committed under color of law, which carries specific federal sentencing enhancements. She held his gaze. Think very carefully about your next move. She watched him take it in. She watched the words land, and she watched what they did to him, which was not what she had hoped for. Her precision, her calm, the legal fluency of her warning produced in Dale Pruitt not caution, but a particular kind of rage that she recognized immediately from her years on the bench. It was the rage of a bully, confronted by someone who was not afraid. Her articulation was not a deterrent to him. It was evidence that she still had something left to take. "Are you threatening me?" he said, his voice dropping. "In my jail." He moved fast for a man his size. He crossed the cell in 2 steps, grabbed a thick handful of her locks near the root and pulled. The pain was sharp and immediate. Her scalp yanked forward, her neck wrenched, and she locked her jaw against it and did not make a sound. He raised the shears. Snip. Then a deep, wet mechanical crunch as the blades worked through the thick, dense mat of her hair. A lock fell to the concrete floor. Renata Cross did not scream. She did not beg. She did not close her eyes. She locked her gaze on the blinking red light of the security camera in the upper corner of the cell, and she did not look away from it for a single second of what followed. Pruitt kept going. He was not careful, and he was not quick. He worked with a methodical, ugly thoroughness, grabbing handfuls and cutting, pulling when the shears snagged, tearing when they couldn't cut cleanly. It was not a trim. It was a destruction. Chunk after chunk fell around her feet, piling on the cold concrete, 18 years of growth, reduced to a ruined scatter on a dirty floor. The sound of the shears was the sound of something irreplaceable being permanently severed. Garrett in the corridor had turned completely away, his shoulders shaking. Through all of it, Renata did not look away from the camera. She memorized the smell of Pruitt's wool uniform. She memorized the cadence of his breathing. She memorized the specific contemptuous sound he made when a lock was thicker than he expected. She memorized the silence of the man in the doorway who could have stopped this and chose not to. She memorized all of it, and she filed it away, and she let the camera see everything. When Pruitt finished, he stepped back. Renata's head was barely recognizable, a jagged, uneven landscape of shorn roots and patches of bare scalp, where the shears had gone in too deep, the longer remaining fragments sticking up at broken angles. The floor around her feet was covered in what had been her hair, thick, beautiful locks scattered in the posture of discarded things. Pruitt looked at his work. He breathed heavily through his nose, the way a man breathes after physical labor. Then he kicked a pile of the severed locks with the toe of his boot, sending them skittering across the concrete, and looked at her with the satisfied expression of someone who had settled a score. "There," he said. "Now you look like a proper inmate. Maybe next time you'll show a little respect to the badge." He turned, walked out, pulled the cell door shut behind him. The lock engaged. His footsteps receded down the corridor. The heavy door at the end of the block opened and closed. Silence. Renata stood perfectly still in the center of the cell. The caged light buzzed above her. The camera blinked in the corner. Around her feet, her history lay in pieces on a dirty floor. Very slowly she raised her right hand and touched the ruins of what was left on her head. Her fingers moved through the jagged shorn edges, feeling the exposed scalp, the uneven terrain where 18 years of careful growth had been hacked away in 20 minutes. And then, because she was alone, and because the camera could not pick up something this small, and because she had earned it. A single tear formed in her left eye and tracked slowly down her cheek. It was not a tear of defeat. Let that be absolutely clear. It was not grief or helplessness, or the kind of crying that concedes anything to the person who caused it. It was the tear of a woman who had built her entire adult life on the principle that the law was the great equalizer, who had dedicated herself to the proposition that no one stood above it, and who had just sat in a concrete cell and watched a man with a badge prove with a pair of shears and 17 years of impunity behind him that he had never believed a single word of that proposition for a single day of his career. She let it fall. Then she straightened. She sat back on the bench, perfectly straight, hands folded on her knees. She looked at the camera. It was 3:28 a.m. on Friday. In exactly 72 hours, give or take, she would be walking through the heavy oak doors at the rear of courtroom 4B in the 11th Circuit, Federal Courthouse, ascending the 3 steps to the bench, settling into the high-backed chair, and looking out across a room full of attorneys and reporters and city officials and police union representatives assembled for the preliminary evidentiary hearing of the most significant police corruption trial this city had seen in a generation. And at the witness table in his pressed dress uniform would be Officer Dale Pruitt of the Claremont Police Department. His name sat at the very top of the prosecution's witness list, right where she had placed it 8 weeks ago. He had not looked at her driver's license. He had not checked her name against any database. He had not, in 17 years of relying on the system's willingness to protect him, developed any habit of caution, because caution was for people who expected consequences, and Dale Pruitt had never been given reason to expect any. She allowed herself the thought, quiet and cold and absolute. He has no idea. He has absolutely no idea what he has done. And then she folded her hands more firmly in her lap, fixed her eyes on the middle distance, and waited for dawn with the patience of a woman who had built her entire life on the understanding that justice was not fast, but it was in the end inevitable. At 5:45 a.m., the night shift supervisor, a different sergeant from Briggs, a younger man named Torres, who had the worn look of someone covering a double unlocked cell 4, and informed Renata without meeting her eyes that she could make her phone call. She stood smoothed the front of her hoodie and walked to the phone at the end of the block with the steady gait of a woman who has not lost a step. She dialed from memory. She did not dial a friend. She did not dial anyone to cry to. She dialed the cell phone of Marcus Cross, her husband of 22 years, founding partner at Cross and Delaney, a civil rights litigation firm with offices in Atlanta, Savannah, and Washington, D.C., a track record that included 3 landmark cases decided at the federal appellate level, and a reputation that made city attorneys in 4 states quietly anxious whenever his name appeared on a filing. Marcus picked up on the second ring. He had been awake. She told him in exactly the right order everything that had happened: the stop, the time, the badge number, the charges, the phone call, denial, the shears, the camera, the preservation issue. She did not cry. She did not editorialize. She gave him the facts in the sequence and specificity that she would have given them from the bench, because Marcus Cross did not need her emotion. He needed her precision, and she gave it to him like a weapon, which is exactly what it was. When she finished, there was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds. "I'll be there in 2 hours, Marcus said. "Don't touch anything." "I know," she said. "I need Agent Fowler." Already thinking it. She placed the phone back on its cradle and walked back to her cell, and the door closed behind her, and she sat in the thin early light coming through the single high window and waited. At 8:07 a.m., the precinct's automated fingerprint identification system completed its overnight software update and came back online. Sergeant Walt Briggs, bleary-eyed on his 4th cup of coffee, and beginning the backlog of overnight processing, fed Renata's fingerprints into the scanner as a routine booking finalization. He settled back in his chair, expecting the standard civilian profile to populate name, date of birth, priors, or none address. The system ran for 30 seconds. Then the screen did not return a standard profile. It returned a bright red federal classification banner that Briggs had, in 29 years, never seen come up on a routine booking scan. He leaned forward, adjusted his glasses. Name, Renata Elaine Cross. Status, United States District Court Judge, 11th Circuit. Security classification, federal. Do not detain without federal authorization. Contact DOJ Public Integrity Section. The styrofoam coffee cup slipped from Briggs's hand. Hot coffee spread across the desk and began dripping onto his lap. He did not move. He was staring at the screen with the expression of a man watching a building he is standing in begin to fall. He looked at the holding cell manifest on the adjacent screen. Cell 4. Booked 12:48 a.m. Arresting officer. Pruitt D. Badge 1147. He looked back at the federal banner. "Oh, God," Briggs whispered. The words came out barely above breath. "Oh, my dear God." He reached for his phone. He did not know who to call first. He did not know if there was a first if any call he made could address the magnitude of what he was looking at. He had spent 29 years not asking questions about what Pruitt brought in. In 11 minutes, that decision was going to cost him everything. He never got to make the call. The heavy double doors of the Claremont 6th Precinct opened at 8:21 a.m., with the particular authority of doors that are pushed by people who have every legal right to push them. Marcus Cross came through first. He was 50 years old, lean with close-cropped gray at his temples, and he was wearing a charcoal suit that had been put on at speed, but still looked as though it had been tailored for exactly this occasion. Because Marcus Cross had a quality that Renata had once described to a friend as constitutional calm. The ability to contain enormous fury in a container so controlled that it read to anyone watching as absolute authority. His jaw was set in a way that communicated that he had exactly one agenda item for the morning, and that item would be completed before he left the building. Behind him walked Special Agent Diane Fowler and her partner, Special Agent James Reedy, both of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, both in dark tactical business wear, both with federal credentials already in hand. Fowler was 43, black, with a close-cropped natural, and an expression that suggested she had been briefed on the way over, and had arrived at a conclusion about what had happened before she walked through the door. Marcus did not announce himself. He walked to the booking desk, placed his bar card and a federal release order on the counter with 2 fingers, and looked at Sergeant Walt Briggs, who had half risen from his chair, still pale, the coffee stain spreading across his lap with the kind of focused, quiet attention that is more frightening than any raised voice. "You have my wife in holding cell 4, Marcus said. His voice was perfectly even. "You are going to release her to me immediately. You are not going to speak to any officer in this building before you do that. And while you are getting her, Agent Fowler here is going to serve you with a federal preservation warrant covering every piece of security footage, every dash camera record, every log, and every document generated in this precinct between 11 p.m. last night and 6 a.m. this morning." He paused to let the scope of that register. If a single frame of that footage is corrupted, deleted, or altered in any way by anyone at any level of this department, the individual responsible will be personally indicted for federal obstruction of justice. "Do you understand what I am telling you, Sergeant?" Briggs nodded. He nodded so quickly and so thoroughly that the movement looked structural, like a building deciding to cooperate with gravity. He grabbed the cell block keys. Fowler served the preservation warrant with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times, and found it satisfying when the circumstances warranted it. They brought Renata out through the cell block door 2 minutes later. She walked steadily, same gait, same posture, and Marcus stepped forward, and his careful, controlled composure held for exactly the 2 seconds it took for him to see her fully in the light of the booking area. He saw the bruised, laced red marks encircling her wrists. He saw the grime on her hoodie and the dark stain on her knee where she had been slammed against the car. And then he saw her head, the jagged, brutalized landscape of what was left of the Locs. He had watched her tend for 18 years. The bare patches of scalp, the broken, uneven remnants, and something moved behind his eyes that he contained forcibly through an act of will that cost him something visible. He stepped forward. He shrugged off his expensive wool overcoat. He settled it gently around her shoulders. "Renata, don't." Her voice was soft, but it had iron in it. Not at him, never at him, but at the sentiment at the beginning of something that she knew would, if she let it start here, be very difficult to stop. She looked past his shoulder to where Fowler stood holding a tablet. "Did you secure the server?" Fowler met her eyes directly. "We have physical possession of the precinct hard drives, Your Honor. Nothing on those drives is accessible to anyone without our authorization." Renata nodded a single complete motion. She pulled Marcus's coat tighter around her shoulders. "Good. Let's go home. I have court on Sunday." She walked to the door. "I want Pruitt's dash camera from Cruiser 1147 in federal custody by this afternoon." "Already on the warrant," Fowler said, falling into step beside her. The precinct door closed behind them. Sergeant Walt Briggs sat back down at his desk and stared at the federal classification banner that was still glowing on his computer screen and the coffee that was still dripping from the desk onto his shoe, and understood that his retirement cabin in the Smokies had just become a significantly more complicated destination. Dale Pruitt spent his Friday night and Saturday at Harley's Bar on Clement Street, a place that smelled of draft beer and decades of accumulated grievance, a bar where off-duty CPD officers gathered to drink and decompress and tell stories that made their day sound more heroic in retrospect than it had been in real time. Pruitt held court at his usual corner stool, a draft in one hand, telling the story of the loudmouth on Route 7, with the expansive self-satisfaction of a man who had handled something that needed handling. He did not know that 60 miles away, in the FBI's regional field office in Hartsdale, Special Agent Diane Fowler was sitting in front of 3 monitors, reviewing footage from the 6th Precinct in the particular way of a federal investigator who already knows what she is looking at and is now confirming it frame by frame. She had the dash camera footage from Cruiser 1147 on the left screen. It showed Renata Cross's pilot moving at exactly the speed limit for a full 1.5 miles before Pruitt hit his lights, and then showed with devastating clarity everything that happened at the shoulder of Route 7, from the moment the cruiser door opened to the moment Renata was put in the back. The right screen showed the holding cell camera. Fowler had watched the cell footage twice. She had not changed her expression on the second viewing because she was a professional. But when Reedy brought coffee and set it next to her keyboard, she said without looking away from the screen, "Get me a federal warrant for the shears." Pruitt drank 3 more beers and told the story again to a group that came in late. He had convinced himself, as he often did, after an aggressive stop, that the discomfort he felt immediately afterward had been misread as doubt, when in fact it was simply the natural adrenaline crash of doing a difficult job. He told himself that the quiet of the past 18 hours was the silence of a system that had once again absorbed what he'd done, processed it, and filed it away. He had never been seriously challenged by a single arrest he'd made in 17 years. He had no reason to expect this one to be any different. He went home at midnight. He set his alarm for 6. He slept without difficulty. Shane Garrett did not sleep at all. Garrett sat on the edge of his bed in his apartment, still in his uniform shirt, his phone on his knee. He had replayed the night in the only way that a 26-year-old with an intact conscience can replay something like that, not to justify it, but to look for the moments where he could have intervened, where a word or a step or a hand on a shoulder might have stopped it. He counted 8 of them. He had used exactly one, the quiet, insufficient, immediately overridden Brad. She didn't assault you at the scene. And he had said nothing after that. He had watched Dale Pruitt walk into that cell with industrial shears at 3 in the morning, and he had turned his back. He opened his phone on Saturday night and saw a brief local news alert. No names, no details. Just a note that a woman had been allegedly assaulted during detention at the 6th Precinct and that the FBI had been called in. He read it 3 times. He set the phone face down on the bed, stared at the ceiling for 90 seconds, and then picked it up again. He found the number for the FBI field office in Hartsdale. He sat with it on his screen for 4 minutes, his thumb hovering over the call button. Then he pressed it. And when the duty agent answered, Garrett said, "My name is Shane Garrett. I'm an officer with the Claremont Police Department. I need to talk to someone about what happened at the 6th Precinct last night." His voice shook on the last sentence. "I was there. I have information. I want to come in." He was at the field office at 8 the following morning. He surrendered his badge to Agent Fowler in person. He sat at a table with a federal prosecutor and gave a full recorded confession that lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes, covering not only the events of Thursday night in their entirety, but 7 previous incidents over 4 months in which he had witnessed or been directed to participate in conduct by Pruitt that he now understood to have been illegal. He handed over the physical trauma shears, which Pruitt had left in the first aid cabinet outside the cell block. They still carried Renata's DNA on the blades and Pruitt's fingerprints on the handle grips. Fowler had them logged and bagged before noon. She called Renata's cell at 12:30. "We have the shears, the dash footage, and a full confession from the partner. Everything is verified and in custody," Good Renata said. She was at home, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, the remains of her hair tucked under a soft wrap. Her son had come into the kitchen that morning, seen her, and not said a word, just walked to her and put his arms around her and held on. She had held him back for a long time. "I'll see you Monday morning." She spent Sunday in her home office reviewing the corruption trial files. She was thorough. She was focused. She was entirely prepared. On Sunday night, she opened her closet and laid out her judicial robe for the morning. She would wear no wig. She would wear no wrap. She would walk into that courtroom exactly as Dale Pruitt had left her, and she would let every person in that room see precisely what he had done and understand precisely who he had done it to. Dale Pruitt reported for his Monday morning shift at 7:30, humming to himself in the locker room, completely unaware that the trap had been built, baited, and sealed around him, and that the woman he had left sitting on a cold steel bench 3 days ago had spent every conscious hour since constructing the walls of it from the inside. The 11th Circuit Federal Courthouse in downtown Claremont was a structure that understood its own gravity. It was built of white marble and polished granite, its facade rising 6 stories above Madison Street in clean vertical lines, designed to communicate permanence and weight. The lobby had a 40-foot ceiling and a marble floor that turned every footstep into an echo, a reminder that sound carried here, that words spoken inside these walls became part of a record that outlasted the people who spoke them. The federal seal above the main entrance, the eagle, the scales, was not decorative. It was a statement of jurisdiction. It said here, "The rules apply to everyone." Courtroom 4B occupied most of the 4th floor's eastern wing. It was a large, serious room, heavy oak paneling on 3 walls, tall windows facing east that let in the morning light in long, angled columns, a gallery that could seat 80, and was on this particular Monday morning packed to capacity, and then some. Reporters from the Atlanta Constitution, the Savannah Morning News, 2 national wire services, and 3 television affiliates had been assigned seats in the first 3 rows. Behind them sat city council members and their aides. Behind them sat a row of police union representatives in pressed suits who had the tight, guarded expressions of men who had arrived expecting a manageable situation and were beginning to sense that the situation might be less manageable than they'd hoped. The gallery murmured with the particular energy of a room that knows something significant is about to happen. At the defense table to the right of the aisle sat Officer Dale Pruitt, dressed in his ceremonial uniform, pressed dark blue with brass buttons and gold trim. His service commendations aligned on his chest in their proper order. He leaned back in the leather chair, with his forearms resting on the table, a piece of gum working slowly in his left jaw, exuding the kind of comfortable arrogance that comes from 17 years of walking into courtrooms like this one and walking back out unscathed. Beside him sat his union defense attorney, Greg Slattery. Expensive suit, silver hair. The smooth, practiced calm of a man whose entire job consisted of cleaning up messes, like Dale Pruitt's career, and billing handsomely for the service. They spoke in low tones, Slattery reviewing a legal pad, Pruitt barely listening. At the prosecution table sat Camille Okafor, federal prosecutor, late 30s, natural hair in a close-cropped fade dark suit. She was arranging her files with the kind of contained, methodical focus of a person who is holding something very large, very steady, and she had been doing it since she arrived an hour before anyone else. She did not look at Pruitt. She had no reason to. The wall clock above the jury box read 8:59. The bailiff, Officer Thomas Clay, moved to his position near the rear door of the bench. He checked his watch. He looked at the door. He straightened. "All rise," Clay called out, and his voice in that large room was a physical event. It filled the space and snapped 100 people to their feet in a single movement. The Honorable United States District Court for the 11th Circuit is now in session. The Honorable Judge Renata Cross presiding. God save the United States and this honorable court. The rear door behind the bench opened, and Renata Cross walked out. She wore her judicial robe. Full, floor length, the deep black of federal judicial authority, immaculate, perfectly pressed, as precise and unarguable as the institution it represented. She walked with the unhurried, deliberate pace that 22 years in courtrooms had built into her the gait of a person who understands that the room is already hers and does not need to claim it. She had made her choice the night before, sitting in front of her bathroom mirror at the close of a very long Sunday, looking at what was left of her hair in the light. She had considered options. She had considered covering it, wrapping it, presenting to the world something that acknowledged the violation without exhibiting it. She had considered it for perhaps 30 seconds. And then she had decided against it completely, with a clarity that felt less like a decision and more like a recognition of something that had already been true. She would not cover it. She would sit on the bench of a federal courtroom in the full light of a Monday morning with her hair exactly as Dale Pruitt had left it, because the people in that room had a right to see what had been done, and because the record of this court would be served by evidence, and because she was tired, profoundly, molecularly tired, of the expectation that black women make themselves presentable around the damage done to them. She climbed the 3 steps to the bench and took her seat. The gallery erupted in a low, confused wave of sound, not quite chaos, but the sound of 100 people simultaneously revising their understanding of what was happening. Reporters leaned forward with the urgent energy of people recognizing a story that is larger than the one they came to cover. A union representative in the 3rd row leaned over to whisper something to the man beside him. Slattery frowned, his eyes moving quickly between the judge's face and the jagged, brutalized ruins of her hair. At the witness table, Dale Pruitt had been standing with the unhurried indifference of a man who considers standing for a judge to be a technicality rather than a genuine acknowledgement of authority. His eyes moved up to the bench with the lazy, assessing scan of someone who expects to see a stranger and has already prepared his performance for that stranger. He saw her face first. The recognition was not immediate. His brain processed the face with the particular delay of a person seeing something outside the context in which they know it, like encountering someone from work in a grocery store, that split second of "I know this person from somewhere." Then the context assembled itself. Route 7. The flashlight beam. The car door. The cell. The shears. Then his eyes moved to her hair. The piece of gum fell out of his open mouth. It landed on the polished oak of the table with a small, definitive sound that in the silence of the next half-second seemed much louder than it had any right to be. Every drop of blood drained from Dale Pruitt's face in what appeared to be a simultaneous, total evacuation, leaving his skin the color and texture of old parchment. His knees buckled, not dramatically, not a collapse, but a visible involuntary bend that forced him to grab the edge of the table with both hands to stay upright. His chest locked. His lungs stopped operating normally. The arrogant, comfortable 17-year reinforced certainty that the system would protect him. That certainty, which had been the load-bearing wall of his entire professional identity, cracked down the middle in the space of 3 seconds, and both halves fell inward. Greg Slattery turned to look at his client. He saw the color, the posture, the shaking hands. He touched Pruitt's arm. Brad, what is wrong with you?" The whisper was sharp with alarm. "You look like you're having a cardiac event." Pruitt could not speak. He could only stare at the woman on the bench, at his brutal handiwork displayed in the harsh fluorescent light of a federal courtroom, at the woman who had looked at the security camera in that cell while he cut her hair, at the woman who had been measuring him for this room for 67 hours. Renata arranged her files on the bench with deliberate, unhurried care. She placed her reading glasses on. She uncapped her pen, and then she raised her eyes from the bench and found Pruitt in the room. Found him without searching, without scanning, with the direct, absolute attention of someone who knows exactly where to look, and she held his gaze for one long, measured moment. She did not glare. She did not allow herself the indulgence of visible anger. She looked at him the way a very good judge looks at the facts of a case that has already been decided by the evidence, with the cold, complete, dispassionate attention of someone for whom the outcome is already clear. "Be seated," Judge Wallace commanded. Pruitt fell into his chair. "Before we commence with today's scheduled evidentiary proceedings," Renata said, her voice filling the room in that unhurried, carrying way that a judge's voice fills a courtroom, not amplified by effort, but by authority, "I must address a procedural matter of the highest gravity. I am entering a formal statement into the federal record." Federal Prosecutor Camille Okafor rose from her seat. "The government is ready to receive the court's statement, Your Honor." "Thank you." Renata did not look at Okafor. She looked at Slattery. "Mr. Slattery, does your client, Officer Pruitt, understand the federal penalties for perjury under oath and for the deprivation of civil rights under color of law?" Slattery rose, deeply uncertain about where this was going, the way a man on thin ice is uncertain about his next step. "Yes, Your Honor. My client is a 17-year law enforcement veteran. He is fully conversant with applicable law." "Good." Renata's tone had not changed, not harder, not softer, just clear in the way that a bell is clear. "Let the record reflect that Officer Dale Pruitt of the Claremont Police Department is currently scheduled to testify in this court as a key witness in the federal corruption indictments against members of his department's narcotics unit." She paused for one beat. "However, I find myself confronting an unprecedented ethical obligation. The Judicial Code of Conduct requires a federal judge to recuse herself from any proceeding in which her impartiality might reasonably be questioned, specifically when a judge has personal knowledge of disputed evidentiary facts concerning a party, or when a judge is the direct victim of a violent felony committed by a defendant or witness appearing before her." The gallery went still, not gradually, all at once, as though someone had removed the sound from the room and left only the weight of what had just been said hanging in the air. Reporters' hands stopped moving on their notepads. A union representative's coffee cup paused halfway to his mouth. Slattery's expression underwent a rapid, involuntary transformation. "Your Honor, I'm not certain I understand the application. Let me clarify it for you, counselor. And here, for the first time, there was something beneath the judicial composure. Not anger, in any conventional sense, but a gravity, a density. Something that had been compressed for 3 days under tremendous pressure and was now being released in the measured, controlled way of a woman who has decided exactly how much force is required. This past Thursday night at 11:52 p.m., I was driving home from my chambers on Route 7 when I was pulled over by Officer Pruitt with no articulable suspicion for the stop. I was forcibly removed from my vehicle without legal basis. I was thrown against my car door, sustaining a dislocated shoulder and lacerations to both wrists. I was transported to the 6th Precinct and booked on fabricated charges that Officer Pruitt invented to justify his conduct. She raised her right hand and touched gently, briefly, the jagged, shorn ends of what remained of her hair. A single, simple gesture. The room took it in, while held in holding cell 4 without my phone call, without Miranda warnings, without any of the constitutional protections that this nation's legal framework guarantees to every person regardless of who they are. Officer Pruitt entered my cell at 3 a.m. with a pair of industrial trauma shears and forcibly cut off my hair. She lowered her hand. He cited a fabricated hygiene protocol. His rookie partner objected. Officer Pruitt overrode that objection with a threat to the younger man's employment. Her eyes moved from Slattery to rest on Pruitt himself. Every word of what I have just stated is documented on the precinct's holding cell security footage, which has been in federal custody since 6:15 Friday morning. For a moment, nothing happened. The room absorbed it. And then not all at once, but in a cascade, one realization triggering the next. The gallery broke open. Union representatives rose partially from their seats. Reporters wrote furiously. The 2 television affiliates in the front row exchanged a glance that communicated without words that this moment was going to be played on their broadcasts for a very long time. Slattery was on his feet. Your Honor, I, the defense, requests an immediate recess to consult Renata. Brought the gavel down once. A single crack, sharp as a rifle shot. The room settled. You will have your opportunity, Mr. Slattery, but the record requires the complete statement. She looked back at the room, at all of it. The reporters, the union men, the city officials, the cameras positioned in the back behind the gallery rope. Furthermore, the court is in possession of the dashboard camera footage from Officer Pruitt's cruiser, which shows my vehicle traveling at the posted speed limit for 1.4 miles before Officer Pruitt activated his emergency lights. The footage shows no traffic violation, no erratic driving, and no basis for the stop. The footage then shows Officer Pruitt's conduct at the shoulder of Route 7 in its entirety. Another pause. And I must inform the court of one additional development, which bears directly on the matter of evidence and Officer Pruitt's expectation of protection. The heavy oak doors at the rear of the gallery swung open. Special Agent Diane Fowler came through first, followed by 3 additional FBI agents in dark tactical attire, their federal credentials clipped to their outer pockets. They walked down the center aisle, in the particular way of federal agents executing something they have prepared carefully, not rushing, not theatrical, just inexorable. Just Officer Pruitt. Renata said, and her voice was very quiet now, which was somehow the most frightening thing she had done in the last 10 minutes. You relied on the blue wall of silence, on the understanding that the institution would absorb what you did, as it has absorbed everything else you have done for 17 years. She let that sit for a moment. But cowardice is not a reliable foundation. When faced with federal charges for complicity in a civil rights violation and obstruction of justice, your partner, Officer Shane Garrett, made a different choice. Pruitt's head snapped sideways toward the rear of the room. There was no one there, but his hands, already shaking, began to tremble visibly on the table surface. Officer Garrett drove himself to the FBI field office on Sunday morning. He surrendered his badge. He gave a complete 2-hour recorded confession detailing every element of what occurred on Thursday night and in your patrol car for the 4 months he rode with you. She watched Pruitt carefully. He also surrendered the physical trauma shears you used in Cell 4. They have been forensically processed. They carry my DNA on the cutting blades and your fingerprints on both handle grips. The chain of custody is documented and unbroken. Greg Slattery had gone entirely pale. He looked at Pruitt, at the man he had arrived this morning prepared to defend, and then he looked at the approaching federal agents, and then he looked down at the table, and he made a calculation that took approximately 4 seconds. He pushed back his chair. He picked up his leather briefcase. "Your Honor," he said, his voice stripped of its practiced confidence, leaving something thinner underneath. "I am formally withdrawing as counsel for Officer Pruitt. I was not informed by my client of any of the material facts you have described. I cannot ethically continue as his representative given the nature of these disclosures." He looked at Pruitt once briefly with the expression of a man leaving a burning building. "I'm sorry, Brad." He walked away from the table, down the aisle, through the gallery, out the rear door. Dale Pruitt sat alone at the defense table. No attorney, no union representative, no captain, no structure of protection. Just a man in a pressed uniform in a room full of people who were all, every single one of them, staring at him. Renata set her gavel on the bench. "Officer Dale Pruitt," she said, "I am formally recusing myself from the federal corruption trial involving your narcotics unit, as I am now the chief complaining witness in the federal criminal case against you personally." She looked at Agent Fowler, who had taken her position 6 feet from the defense table. "I am remanding Officer Pruitt into the custody of the Federal Bureau of Investigation on charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, aggravated battery, and obstruction of justice. These charges supersede his scheduling in this court." She looked at Pruitt one final time, directly, without flinching, without theater. Just one person looking at another with absolute clarity. Agent Fowler. Fowler moved to the table. She took Pruitt's right arm, then his left, and brought them together behind his back with the efficiency of someone who has done this hundreds of times and finds no particular drama in it, only procedure. The handcuffs came out of her belt. She positioned them, and then, with a sharp, double-clicking metallic sound that echoed in the high-ceilinged room, they ratcheted shut around Pruitt's wrists. It was the exact same sound, the exact same cold bite of metal closing around a wrist on a rainy night. Renata heard it and recognized it from the inside out, and she did not allow herself anything more than one slow, quiet breath. "You have the right to remain silent," Fowler said, her voice low and close to Pruitt's ear. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed to you." She stepped back and took Pruitt's arm to guide him. "Let's go." They walked him down the center aisle, past the reporters, past the union men who looked at the floor or at the ceiling or at their phones, anywhere that was not the direction of Dale Pruitt's face, past the gallery full of people who had come to watch a police corruption trial and were now watching something considerably more immediate. Down the aisle and through the heavy oak doors and out into the marble corridor of the federal courthouse. When the doors closed, the room held its silence for one long moment. Then Camille Okafor turned to the remaining gallery and made a quiet note on her legal pad. The court reporter's fingers moved steadily on her keys. The morning light came through the eastern windows in its long, angled columns. Renata Cross picked up her gavel. She held it for a moment. Then she set it back down very gently and allowed herself one thing, not a smile, not a victory, but a single slow exhale, the kind that releases something that has been held at tremendous cost. "Court is in recess," she said. By noon on Monday, the footage had reached every major news outlet in the country. It was not the cell footage that was sealed in federal evidence. What the press had was the courtroom video, which the federal courthouse's public recording system had captured in full. It had been filed by a pool reporter within 40 minutes of the hearing's end, and by the time the lunch hour hit, the Eastern Time Zone, it was the top story on every major network, every cable news channel, and every major digital news platform simultaneously. The image that led every broadcast was still Judge Renata Cross, seated at the federal bench in her judicial robe, the jagged, violently shorn remnants of her hair visible under the courtroom lights. Her expression perfectly composed, looking down at the man who had done it from the elevation of absolute legal authority. The contrast between the dignity of the robe and the brutality of what it sat beneath was, as one anchor put it that evening, a photograph that makes its point without requiring a caption. The story had, as these stories sometimes do when they are clear and complete and undeniable, an accelerating quality each hour brought a new development that compounded the last. By 10 a.m., the Claremont Police Department had confirmed it was cooperating with the FBI investigation. By noon, Chief of Police Thomas Sullivan was standing at a podium on the steps of City Hall with the specific expression of a man attempting to outrun a fire he helped light. He announced in a statement that had clearly been drafted in a hurry and vetted by city attorneys, before Sullivan had quite finished his second sentence of the morning, that Officer Dale Pruitt had been terminated without pension effective immediately, and that the department was providing complete and unqualified cooperation to the Department of Justice and the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. The police union, historically among the loudest and most reflexive defenders of its membership, an organization that had intervened in defense of officers with conduct records far worse than Pruitt's, and had never once hesitated, issued a statement of 4 sentences. The statement condemned the conduct. The statement announced that the union would not fund Pruitt's legal defense. The statement noted that the behavior described was incompatible with the values of law enforcement, a phrase that landed with the particular hollow ring of language chosen for its defensibility rather than its honesty. The statement wished the victim a full and speedy recovery. In 17 years, the Claremont Police Union had never not once declined to fund the legal defense of one of its members. The 4 sentences were read carefully by the federal prosecutors working the corruption case and noted in their files. Sergeant Walt Briggs was suspended without pay, pending a formal misconduct hearing for his failure to properly process a detained individual, his failure to identify a federal officer presented for booking, and his general enabling of the unlawful detention through inaction. The entire 6th Precinct night shift was placed under federal oversight, pending a full operational review. Captain Vic Harlan Pruitt's longtime protector, the man who had described 17 use-of-force complaints as the file of a tough but effective officer, received a federal notice of investigation by close of business Monday. At Whitfield Federal Detention Center, a grim processing facility on the outskirts of Claremont that Pruitt had driven past hundreds of times without giving it a thought, Officer Dale Pruitt was processed into the federal detention population in the specific way that he had over 17 years processed dozens of others. He was told to remove his uniform. He was given a medical screening. He was issued clothing. He was photographed, printed, and assigned a number. He was placed in administrative segregation because former law enforcement officers in federal custody become targets in the general population, and the institution was responsible for his safety, even if he had shown no particular concern for the safety of others. His cell was 8 feet by 10. He had 23 hours a day inside it, and 1 hour outside in a small concrete exercise yard under supervision. For a man whose entire identity had been constructed on the architecture of physical dominance and freedom of movement, who had defined himself for 17 years by his ability to compel other people's behavior, the cell was not merely uncomfortable. It was the specific, particular destruction of every assumption he had ever made about himself. The federal prosecution of United States versus Pruitt was in the clinical assessment of the legal press, not a close case. It was the kind of case that prosecutors call evidence-rich, a term that means the defendant's guilt is supported by so many independent corroborating sources that constructing a defense requires not merely challenging individual pieces of evidence, but dismantling an entire architecture of documentation that had been built by a federal judge, an FBI unit, and a cooperating witness before the defendant was even aware he was under investigation. Shane Garrett took the stand on Tuesday afternoon of the second trial day. He was no longer a police officer. He wore a dark gray suit that he had bought for the occasion, and he sat in the witness chair with the rigid posture of a man making himself stay in place through an act of will. He did not look at Pruitt. He had decided before the trial began that he would not look at Pruitt during his testimony because he was not sure he could maintain the steadiness required while looking at him. And steadiness was what he owed to this proceeding and to the woman who sat in the front row of the gallery watching. Prosecutor Okafor guided him through the events of Route 7 with methodical patience. Garrett answered every question. He described the stop, no violation, no basis. Pruitt's instigation without legal cause. He described the shoulder of Route 7, the door, the arm, the slam, the handcuffs. He described Renata's conduct throughout, calm, precise, non-resisting, narrating her every movement. He described his own failure to intervene beyond that one insufficient word. His voice broke once in the middle of a sentence describing cell 4, and he stopped, took a breath, and finished the sentence. When Okafor asked him why he had ultimately gone to the FBI, he was quiet for a moment before answering. Because I kept thinking about her staring at that camera, he said, while he was doing it. She was looking right at the camera and not looking away. And I realized she was already doing what I should have done. She was already fighting back with the only thing available to her. And I had what she didn't. I had a badge and a radio and the ability to stop it. And I turned my back and put my hands over my face. He paused. That's not something you get to sleep through. The defense, conducted by an overworked federal public defender named Craig Mosby, who had taken the case because he had no choice, and proceeded with the professionalism the job required, if not the enthusiasm the cause inspired, attempted a cross-examination that lasted 11 minutes and produced nothing useful. Mosby was good enough to know when a witness had been truthful. He was also good enough to know that prolonging the examination would only compound the damage. Renata took the stand on Thursday morning as the prosecution's final witness. She had been described in the press that week, and she was aware of this because she read the press coverage each evening with the detached attention she applied to all information as dignified, composed, and extraordinary. She understood the impulse behind those descriptions and found them, in a quiet way, slightly maddening, because they implied that her composure was exceptional, rather than earned, that it was remarkable, rather than simply her. But she accepted them, because the alternative, making a point of correcting the narrative, would itself have become the story, and the story that mattered was the one being told in this courtroom. She took the oath. She placed her hand on the Bible with the comfort of a person who has done this many, many times, not as a witness, but as the officer of the court who administered the oath. She sat. She looked at Camille Okafor at the podium and waited. For 2 hours she testified. She broke down the stop on Route 7 using the specific constitutional framework, the absence of reasonable articulable suspicion, the requirement for disclosure of the basis for detention, the Fourth Amendment protections governing vehicle stops, and the legal threshold required for physical removal of an occupant. She detailed the booking with the precision of a person who had memorized every element of it as it occurred. She described the denial of Miranda rights and the denial of her phone call with the clinical specificity of someone itemizing exhibits. And when Okafor finally reached the events of Cell 4 and asked her to describe what happened at 3:05 a.m. on Friday, Renata described them in the same voice, no slower, no softer, no different, because the facts did not require performance, and she did not intend to give any. The lights dimmed for the showing of Exhibit C, the precinct security footage. The room had known intellectually what was on the footage. The press had reported on it. The participants in the case had reviewed it. But there is a difference between knowing what a piece of evidence contains and sitting in a room while it plays on a large screen in front of you in real time, and the difference announced itself in the silence that fell over the courtroom from the first frame. They watched Dale Pruitt unlock the cell. They watched him enter with the shears. They watched him approach Renata Cross and grab her by the hair, the movement sudden and large and ugly, in a way that a written description cannot fully convey. They heard the audio, that terrible wet mechanical crunch of steel working through thick, dense hair. And they watched Renata Cross sit perfectly still through all of it, her spine straight, her jaw set, and her eyes fixed unblinking, absolute locked directly onto the camera lens. Not moving, not wavering, looking straight at the people who would one day be watching. 3 jurors put their hands over their mouths. A woman in the second jury seat, a retired elementary school teacher from the south side of Claremont, wept quietly and without self-consciousness. The foreman, a retired postal supervisor named William Hatch, looked at the screen for the duration and then looked at his hands in his lap for a long time after it ended. When the lights came back up, Okafor allowed the silence to exist for a moment before she walked back to the podium. "Judge Cross," she said, "why didn't you tell him who you were?" Renata leaned forward slightly. She looked at the jury. Not at Okafor, not at Pruitt, at the 12 people whose job it was to decide this, and whose understanding of the answer to this question mattered more than anyone else's in the room. "Because if I had told him I was a federal judge," she said, and her voice was level and clear, and carried to every corner of that room without effort, he would have stopped. He would have apologized. He would have uncuffed me and driven me home and spent the rest of the night trying to figure out how to make the last 2 hours disappear. And the following Thursday, he would have found someone else on Route 7, a young woman on her way home from a double shift, a college student driving back to campus, someone who didn't have the legal training to memorize his badge number, or the access to federal resources to secure the footage, or the standing to walk into a courtroom and make this moment matter. She let that settle. I did not tell him who I was because I needed him to finish what he was doing while the camera was recording. I needed the evidence to be complete and unambiguous because the only way to stop Dale Pruitt was not to stop him. Once it was to build a case that ensured he could never do this to anyone ever again. She straightened. "That is why I did not scream. That is why I looked at the camera. I was protecting the next person on Route 7. The chill that moved through the courtroom was physical. Several people shifted in their seats. The foreman looked up from his hands. Craig Mosby's cross-examination lasted 7 minutes. None of it produced a useful answer. He sat back down with the expression of a man who has done his professional duty thoroughly and is glad the doing of it is behind him. The jury entered deliberation at 2:30 p.m. on Thursday. At 3:08 p.m., 38 minutes later, the buzzer sounded. They had their verdict. The return to the courtroom had the quality of a held breath being released. Jenkins sat beside Mosby looking at the table. Renata sat in the front row of the gallery with Marcus's hand in hers, their fingers interlaced, and she looked at the jury box with the calm of someone who had already done everything that could be done and was now simply present for the result. The foreman stood. He held the single sheet. On the first count of the indictment, deprivation of rights under color of law, we the jury find the defendant guilty. Pruitt's shoulders dropped. On the second count, aggravated battery with a deadly weapon, guilty. A sound moved through the gallery. On the third count, obstruction of justice and official misconduct, guilty. Guilty, guilty, guilty. 3 words that closed 17 years. 2 weeks later, at the sentencing hearing in the same courtroom, Judge Harold Tatum looked down at Dale Pruitt from the bench with the expression of a man who has spent 30 years in federal law and is not surprised by this, but is not finished being appalled by it either. "Mr. Pruitt," he said, "in 30 years on the federal bench, I have read a great many presentencing reports describing the abuse of law enforcement authority. What sets your case apart is not its severity, though its severity is considerable. What sets it apart is its revealing clarity. You did not make an error in judgment under pressure. You were not acting in a difficult situation with incomplete information. You drove to that cell block in the middle of the night with a deliberate plan and a pair of shears, and you executed that plan against a helpless handcuffed woman who had committed no crime because she had declined to be afraid of you." He looked at his notes. "The fact that she happened to be a sitting federal judge is, as I have stated for the record, legally irrelevant to your culpability. The crime would have been identical had she been anyone else. The only difference is that she had the tools to ensure that you were held accountable, tools that your other victims, over 17 years, did not have. That is the tragedy that sits beneath this verdict, and it is one this court cannot fully remedy. But it can send a message." He raised his gavel. "Bradley Dale Pruitt, I sentence you to serve a term of 19 years in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. You will not be eligible for early release. You will serve every day of that sentence. Furthermore, your municipal pension is hereby stripped and liquidated, with the proceeds directed as partial restitution to the victims documented in this proceeding. The marshals will remand the prisoner." As the federal marshals took Pruitt by the arms and walked him toward the door, he did not look at the gallery. He did not look at Marcus Cross, who sat in the front row with his hands folded on his knees and his eyes following Pruitt's exit with a quiet, complete attention. He stared at the floor as he walked. He walked like a man who has run out of directions entirely. The door closed behind him. Marcus Cross filed the civil rights lawsuit against the city of Claremont, the Claremont Police Department, and the police union on the morning following the verdict, a $52 million federal action alleging sustained institutional failure to monitor discipline and remove an officer with a documented 17-year pattern of civil rights abuses. The filing was detailed, exhaustive, and airtight, drawing on Pruitt's complete internal affairs history, the union's documented pattern of protecting officers with excessive force records, and a chain of specific incidents spanning more than a decade in which the city's failure to act had directly enabled the conduct that ended in Courtroom 4B. The city's legal team, reviewing the filing, reportedly advised settlement within 72 hours. After 4 months of negotiation, the city agreed to a $28 million settlement, the largest police misconduct settlement in the history of Georgia. Renata and Marcus kept none of it. Every dollar was directed to the Route 7 Justice Initiative, a foundation providing aggressive, no-cost legal representation to victims of police brutality across the state, with a particular focus on individuals who lack the resources or legal standing to pursue accountability on their own. The settlement agreement mandated structural reform at the Claremont PD independent civilian oversight, with subpoena power, mandatory unalterable cloud backup for all body and holding cell camera footage, and the passage of the Cross Act, a Georgia state law lobbied through the legislature by a coalition of civil rights organizations over 6 months and signed into law by the governor, making it a felony for any officer to disable or tamper with a recording device during a civilian encounter. Captain Vic Harlan retired under pressure before his misconduct investigation concluded. Sergeant Walt Briggs lost his pension in arbitration. Shane Garrett, his immunity secured, resigned from law enforcement permanently and joined the Route 7 Justice Initiative as an investigator, applying the skills he had spent 4 months misusing to the work of documenting abuse and protecting the people he had once failed. 14 months after Route 7, the bailiff's voice rang out in a full courtroom 4B on a Tuesday morning in December. All rise, the Honorable Judge Renata Cross presiding. She came through the rear door, robes, immaculate reading glasses in her left hand, a thick file under her right arm. Her locks, 14 months of new growth, framed her face in a full living crown that caught the morning light coming through the eastern windows as she climbed the steps to the bench. She set her file down. She put her glasses on. She looked out at the assembled lawyers with the calm, unshakable authority of a woman who had been tested at the absolute limit of what a person can absorb and had not broken, who had instead turned the experience into law, into protection, into a foundation that had already helped 43 families find accountability that would otherwise have been denied to them. She had survived the worst that unchecked authority could do to a single person in the dark, and she had used it to build something that would outlast her, and outlast the man who had tried to diminish her, and outlast the long, painful road from a cold cell floor to this warm courtroom on a December morning. She picked up her gavel. She let it fall. The crack echoed in the high ceiling like a bell announcing something that is only beginning. Court is in session. If this story moved, you reminded you that justice is worth fighting for, and showed you what it looks like when it finally arrives, subscribe to our channel. There are more stories like this one waiting for you.